Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm your host. I'm Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And welcome back to our Freight Market Roundup. And I know we say this all the time, but there is just so much going on in the world. And we're not going to touch on everything. I'm going to say that right now, but we're going to touch on a lot. So if this is your first time joining us, this is our Freight Market Roundup series. We do this every other week. The goal is a shotgun approach, talking about what's happening on, well, particularly like to focus on prices. So we like to talk about what's happening in this ocean shipping lane, what's happening in this ocean shipping lane, how is that changing, what are we expecting to happen next? When we've got some great air data, we like to bring that in. We've got some great trucking data, we like to bring that in. But generally speaking, we focus on the ocean shipping lanes. Also, what we talk about is the major events that are affecting our teams and also are affecting our customers. The things that are either on the horizon or happening right now, and you should be planning around. So we used to send this out just to our clients. And a while ago, we just said, you know what? Let's just make it a little blast out for just our business community in general to comment on and talk about. So make sure if we're missing something or if you've got an opinion, please add it below. And as always, make sure you're liking, commenting, sharing this so we can get that exposure out there and really keep the conversation going about some of the really interesting things happening under the hood of the supply chain realm that are, well, a lot of things needed attention right now, but isn't that how it always is? Anyway, before we dive in, I want to quick shout out the amazing event that was put on by the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. That was just yesterday. It was Frederick Meyer Gardens. The speaker was the former U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns. And if you don't know Ambassador Burns, well, he served as a U.S. ambassador to China between 2021 and 2025 under the Secretary of State for Political Affairs. From between 2005 and 2008, and then the U.S. ambassador to NATO between 2001 and 2005, and then the U.S. ambassador to Greece from 1997 to 2001. His viewpoints yesterday on geopolitical events were completely invaluable. I mean, it was a phenomenal timing for the event, especially given the Israel-Iran situation, but just a really good view that we can all really accept. And I think we all have a better understanding of this challenging situation we faced, obviously in the Middle East, but also between US and China over the next 5 to 10 years, and how important it is that we kind of go forward correctly, if that makes sense. Now, with that said, let's make sure we dive right in. But as a little final note, you can go online, you can check out the World Affairs. I should actually link that. I'll include that URL to their website so you can kind of see their events coming up in the next year. They have some phenomenal speakers, and we always love participating in their events. So we just want to thank them very much. But let's dive right into our ocean rates, and then we're going to take a step back and discuss some of those major events I was talking about. So first off, Trans-Pacific lane. Specifically, we're going to talk about the shipments that are leaving Southeast Asia and China and headed into the U.S. West Coast ports. So as of this week, our customers are paying an average of $4,480 per FEU. Now, remember, that's an average. And, that's definitely pretty surprising. It's also a pretty surprising decrease from the $5,200 per FEU that we saw just 2 weeks ago. And the reason why this is also surprising is because if we compare our West Coast destined ships to our East Coast destined ships, all coming out of Southeast Asia and China, we're seeing this kind of interesting contrast. So our customers on the East Coast are paying an average of $6,950 per FEU as of this week. It's a relatively sharp uptick from just 2 weeks ago, what we were seeing at $6,150 per FEU. Now, this being said, these ocean rates, first of all, we're getting indications that both of these rates are going to decrease in the following weeks. This last little kind of huge uptick we saw on the U.S. East Coast is kind of a little bit wild for us. And there's something that's important here. Both of these rates are undoubtedly high, extremely high. When you compare pre-pandemic, it's wild. But if you even consider the new costs of shipping, these prices are absolutely wild. But, what we're really seeing here isn't this demand-driven price. It is pretty much the aftershocks of some shipper confusion, quite frankly, and also a pretty challenging beginning of 2025, or at least first 6 months of 2025 for shippers. So with all of the changes that have been taking place on the tariffs between the US and China, a lot of shippers saw that cooling off period as almost like a last chance for, or just a grace window to quickly try to ship as much as possible, front load as much inventory as possible. But the reality of the situation is we're sitting at a 55% tariff rate. That is very high. That is a very high rate. And that's much higher than the original 301 tariffs were. Obviously, during the Biden years, we kept the original Trump tariffs, and we also added tariffs on in specific areas as well. I think EVs is a great example with the 100% tariffs. But what we saw during this grace period is a lot of shippers jump on to make these shipments and then kind of realize, wait, 55%, does this make sense to source all of this front-loaded inventory at 55%? Could we see this going down? And then as we obviously left the cooling off period and started to get to some negotiations that we talked about in London, and 55% really seemed like the number, shippers in general, I think, are a little bit concerned. Now, obviously, these ocean rates got up to the points they're at right now, almost $7,000 heading into the U.S. East Coast because of that huge increase of demand. But what we're seeing right now, specifically when we look at the volumes, is a very different picture. So there was a press briefing on June 13th. Port of Los Angeles, the executive director, Gene Soroka, he said, if you're a trucker who was hauling 4 to 5 containers a day prior to these announcements back in April, you are likely hauling just 2 to 3 loads max. And that was Soroka. Now, the LA port actually saw 17 canceled sailings in May. That resulted in a loss of 225,000 expected container units. And also, when you look at Port of Los Angeles' cargo volumes, they were down 5% year over year in May. And they also decreased 19% month over month when you look April compared to May. So one of the things we're not seeing in these extremely high rates right now are these low volume figures, and particularly when you look at the year over year volumes. Now there is a lot more to talk about here, but we're going to move on. So let's go over to our transatlantic lanes where we are currently seeing a lot of stability. Very different situation from what we're seeing on our Trans-Pacific. So let's start off with our European shipments that are headed into the US West Coast ports. Now, right now, this week, our customers are paying an average of $3,460 per 40-foot equivalent unit. It's the average across all of our ports. And so, in some situations, it's going to be lower, others it's going to be higher. But the one thing that has been true as we take this average week over week is it's almost been at the same cost since the beginning of May. It's been incredibly stable in terms of price. Now let's talk about the shipments that are going into the East Coast. So out of Europe, instead of the West Coast, what about the shipments headed into the East Coast? We're seeing that exact same trend. Not quite as long. We had a slight uptick in price, but for the past 4 weeks, we're seeing a cost of around $2,100, and it's really not trending upward or downward. Now, like we discussed with the Trans-Pacific rates, despite this stability in price, these numbers are like a duck, super calm and majestic above the surface, but underneath the water, it's just churning madly. And that's exactly what's happening right now at these European ports, because these rates are fantastic. They're fantastically stable. You can plan around them. It's great. But the ports themselves, they're a congested mess. And this is directly according to the port directors. And also, according to the port directors, there is not a solution in sight. They're expecting this to go on for months at a minimum. So, apologize on some of these names. Luc Arnouts, he's the Vice President of International Relations and Networks at Europe's busiest port, which is, make sure you leave your comment below. It's the port of Antwerp-Bruges. And so their container yards have been completely full at the main hubs. This is coming from him. They're having issues with incoming ships completely missing their berthing schedule, sometimes coming days later. They're also having to deal with all these intermittent strikes at feeder ports, which have been causing kind of a domino effect of scheduling challenges. And all of this is happening during a low water period in the Rhine. And we also, as we remember, just had this huge Ocean Shipping Alliance shakeup across the board. All these new alliances were formed, services were changed, and everything. All that happened Q1 and Q2. And during all of this period, we were going through a pretty substantial situation in a lot of the European ports. So, and here's another layer as well. On top of all those challenges, in the first 4 months of 2025, the total of Asia to Europe volume was up by 9% year over year to 6.13 million TEUs. And on top of that, Asia to Mediterranean volumes were up by 12.14% year over year to 2.4 million TEUs. And let's quick talk about one more rate before I say this. Currently, our customers are paying $2,750 per FEU when they're shipping from Asia to Europe. And that is a slight increase from what it was a couple weeks back. It's roughly $400 up from 2 weeks ago. But in reality, this rate is extremely reasonable. It's an extremely good rate, especially if you consider how far of a voyage that is. And it is a great rate compared to 2019 rate levels. And if you consider how much more volume is coming through here year over year, and you consider all of the challenges that these ports are dealing with, I just can't help but laugh a little bit, because if we were dealing with a quarter of this at the US ports, our prices would be skyrocketing actively. They're almost looking for a reason to raise them. But so just the point here is pretty simple, like a lesson, so to speak. So a high rate, it does not always equal high demand. And a stable rate doesn't always equal a stable shipping experience. Really, what we're seeing right now is the ocean liners are trying to figure out a very different market from the pre-pandemic market. And as a result, with all this moving and shaking and really just shifting demand and very localized demand, the ocean liners they're just having a challenge in doing that process. So, one thing too I want to finish on is you probably noticed we didn't talk much about Israel and Iran. And there is a lot of coverage of that right now. And really, this could have substantial fallout when it comes to supply chain challenges and disruption, given its location. We've already dealt with some of this before with the Suez and the just Red Sea crisis in general. But we'll talk about that when it starts to become an issue. Obviously, a lot of this has to play out at this point. So we'll dive into that a little bit later. But we really appreciate everybody for joining us today. A lot going on in this market. Make sure you leave a comment on a couple things you'd like us to include in the next episode. But we're always live Thursdays, 1 p.m. Eastern, generally live. We're still working on making sure we're always live. But you're always going to see us Thursdays, at least at 1 p.m. Eastern. We appreciate everybody for joining us. Make it a great week, and we will see you all soon.